Hi, Clint Ayesh, Crestview Wine and Spirits. Welcome to the Scotch education section of CrestviewLiquor.com. In this video, I want to tell you a little bit about Scotch, the way it's made, and the different flavors and aromas that are produced. We're going to talk about the 5 different styles of Scotch and the 5 different regions in which they're produced. To begin, let's define the 5 different types of Scotch whiskies. The first is a single malt Scotch whiskey. This is a whiskey that's been distilled at a single distillery using batch distillation and in pot stills rather than column stills. It's also made solely of barley. The second type of Scotch whiskey is a single grain Scotch whiskey. This is a Scotch whiskey that has been made from some unmalted and some malted cereal grains, usually wheat or corn, but they all have to be blended with barley. Barley is required to be a part of any Scotch that comes out of Scotland. The term single grain is a little confusing even to me. It really means single distillery, not one single grain. Many grains can be used, but the term single grain means it is all produced at one distillery. This might also be a good time to talk about malted and unmalted barley. A lot of people get confused in why they use each one. Malted means it's gone through a process where it's been soaked in water and then it's been air dried in a kiln. We'll talk a little bit more about the kiln in a second. But the kiln dries it out and stops the germination of that grain. When you germinate that grain and bring forth all these monosaccharides and sugars that are present for fermentation to even take place, it speeds up the process and helps the distillery a lot in producing that Scotch. The unmalted is also used at times for the robust flavor that it adds. The proportions are usually a lot higher to the malted, obviously, because it helps speed up the process, but you get a lot of flavor out of the unmalted as well. I mentioned kilning. When they dry out these grains in the kilning process, they can use different sources of fuel for the kilning process and drying those grains out. One thing that they use in Scotland is peat, in places where there's abundance of it. Islay, which Laphroaig is produced in Islay, that is a place where they have a huge abundance of peat and they use to fuel the kilning process. So you'll get that peat and smoke flavor that sometimes comes in contact with the actual Scotch itself. The third type of Scotch whiskey is called blended malt. It's a blend of single malt Scotches, 2 or more single malt Scotches, coming from more than one distillery. The fourth type of Scotch whiskey is called blended grain. Blended grain is just a combination of 2 or more single grain Scotches that have been produced at more than one distillery. The fifth and final type of Scotch whiskey is blended Scotch. Blended Scotch is the type that most of you are familiar with, I'm sure. 95% of the Scotch that we consume worldwide comes from the blended Scotch category. This is a blend of 1 or more single malts and 1 or more single grains. They do this for uniformity, to a little smoother taste, and the consistency across the board so they can keep making the product over and over with the same taste. These are products like Chivas, Johnnie Walker Black, Dewar's, and John Bar. You've heard of many others, Famous Grouse, Grant's. These blended Scotch whiskeys are definitely the entry-level Scotch whiskeys and kind of show you why the single malts tend to get more expensive. We've kind of knocked it down from the most expensive now to the most widely known and least expensive. And they're good entry-level Scotches, and you'll learn to appreciate the single malts a lot more. I really think knowing these 5 different types of Scotch whiskeys is going to help you shop in our store. I also think knowing the 5 different regions of Scotland and the types of Scotches that they produce is going to help you shop for the higher end single malts for sure. A couple other things before we move into the regions I want to talk about. One is age statement. Age statement that is on the bottle, the year, just basically means the youngest Scotch used in that blend or in that bottle is 10 years old or 12 years old, going up all the way to 30 years old. So if many Scotches are used in the bottle, the age statement is only signifying the youngest Scotch that's being used. That's first. Second, you'll find a lot of single malt Scotches that are finished in wood. Most all Scotches are finished in wood, but single malt Scotches have a tendency to use different casks or barrels that have been used to age sherry, or maybe they've been used to age port or Madeira, and they will signify on the bottle this Scotch has been aged in sherry oak cask, or it's a blend of sherry oak and port oak. Those barrels that have aged all those wines, sherry, port, Madeira, and things like that, they will impart different flavors to the Scotch. A little fruitiness, maybe citrus, or just a little softer kind of rounder finish to make it even a little more palatable. Now that we've defined the 5 types of Scotch, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the 5 regions that Scotch comes from located in Scotland. We have the Highlands, the Lowlands, Speyside, Islay, and Campbeltown. Campbeltown is the only one that's not represented here, and the reason is because they didn't produce Scotch for a long time. They kind of lost their status. They're coming back as more distilleries are being added, but currently there's only about 3 distilleries in Campbeltown that are producing Scotch. Basically, we're going to focus on Highland, Lowland, Speyside, and Islay. We'll start with the Highland. The Highlands is the largest region of Scotland producing Scotch whiskey. They're not as robust or complex as other Scotches. They're actually a little bit sweeter, softer, and in some cases a little fruitier. It's a good entry level into the single malt Scotch arena that's on the market today. I've chose Glenmorangie here. Glenmorangie is a perfect example of the medium-priced single malt Scotch that comes from the Highlands. Now let's talk about the Lowlands. The Lowlands is a much smaller region than the Highlands, but still produces a lot of really fine single malt Scotches. They're really well known for triple distillation. The example that I chose here was Auchentoshan, which actually on the label says triple distilled. Not all Scotches from the Lowlands are triple distilled, but they do so much of it, that's what they're really known for. These Scotches are lighter, have a little bit of citrus, even some grassy notes, and a drier finish. But very palatable, very easy drinking Scotches, and again, a pretty nice entry level into the single malt arena. Now let's talk about Speyside. Speyside is the 3rd largest area producing Scotch in Scotland, slightly smaller than the Lowlands and the Highlands. These Scotches are a little more complex, but still very smooth. Some good examples of these types of Scotches would be Macallan and Glenlivet. The 4th and final region that we're going to talk about in this video today is Islay. Remember, the 5th region, Campbeltown, is not represented. Islay is an island in Scotland where there's an abundance of peat. They use this peat as fuel in the kiln drying process that we talked about earlier in the video. The Scotch takes on some of that peat and smoke flavor and aroma, and that's what we mean when we talk about a peated Scotch. It's usually a briny seaweed type aroma, and some people even say a little medicinal. I think Laphroaig is a good example of a medium to full peated Scotch. I hope that knowing a little bit about each region from Scotland helps you find some of the single malts in our store, and I think that knowing the 5 different types of Scotch is really going to help you shop. Remember, as of 2011, Scotland mandated that each of these producers has to put on their label what type of Scotch they are. So if you come into our store and you're looking for a blended Scotch or a single malt Scotch or a single grain Scotch, not only are you going to find it on the label, but you can ask one of our employees. Also, check out all the other educational videos in our education section of the website. I think they'll really help you shop in our store as well. Clint Ayesh, Crestview Wine & Spirits. I'll see you in the next video.